Today I'm going to give you a breakdown of a critique on the current food system and give you some solutions about what to do about it. All right, to begin with a critique on our current food system, one of an author here named Darren Quailman put together an interesting economic critique looking at the Canadian food system and basically looking at the economic viability of our food system here in Canada. And basically the argument of Darren Quailman, who wrote the article in 2011, but actually has updated it since on a link here that I provided to you. So who benefits from our food system economically? You can actually click on this here and it'll get to a link to an article by Darren Quailman that's actually more up to date. But basically the problem is quite similar to what I'm going to describe right now. So if we actually look at the economic viability of farming in Canada, what we notice is actually it's not a viable business. It's actually not economically sustainable. And there are reasons for this. So this doesn't mean that you can't actually make money as a farmer in Canada. This doesn't mean that all the farms are not working properly. What it means actually is we look at the aggregate and we actually look at, and especially looking at debt per farm, as well as the amount of money brought in, what we're noticing is actually the farms are not profitable on the aggregate, okay? So here, actually, we're looking at, in billions of dollars, the agricultural exports, and we could actually see farming is making quite a bit of money on agricultural exports. So actually, if we look over time, we're actually increasing in billions of dollars on agricultural exports, which may seem like this is great because it seems like farms in Canada are doing very well. Now, the thing is actually, if we take into context debt that farms are bringing in, because they're actually buying new technologies, they're buying seeds, they're buying chemical fertilizers, and all of these different things, what we look at here is the net profits or the net income realized from farms. And actually, what we notice up until about 2010, and actually up until now even, is that farms, if you factor in their debts, are not profitable on the aggregate. So why is that the case? Well, actually here we look at the amount of money in farm debts keeps on accumulating. So farmers are taking more and more debt in order to be able to grow food in the efficiencies that they're actually expecting. So basically always going towards more mechanization, going towards agricultural inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, and just buying seeds all the time is actually quite costly. So it actually makes it the situation on the aggregate, farms are not profitable. So we could actually look at farming in Canada and say that farms are not economically sustainable the way they are. Actually, the federal government has put in a lot of subsidies to make sure that farms actually succeed or are at least able to make their ends meet. What we're noticing is we're actually losing a lot of the family farms, and a lot of the farmers are now of the older generation, and there are fewer younger people that have actually embarked into farming. Although actually, if you look at Quebec, there are actually a lot of younger farmers that have now began doing more organic farming and other things like that. So people like Jean-Martin Fortier or other people that are kind of more like celebrity farmers, and other farmers too that are actually getting more involved. So, but in general, is that family farming used to be a thing that was passed on to different generations, and because of issues when it comes to actually sustaining farms economically, it doesn't seem as desirable as a trade from the past. You could actually look at a new report here by Darren Quailman by following this link, and actually the situation has not changed over time. Actually, farmers are accruing more and more debt, and actually the debt in billions of dollars has now surpassed $100 billion. So farming is not sustainable economically. The federal government and other forms of subsidies exist so that farming could actually continue, but it is something that is actually subsidized by taxpayers in Canada. So as you can see on the last slide here, well, another thing that's occurring is actually the money that's going to pesticides and fertilizers companies is increasing also over time. So actually, who is making the money off of Canadian farming? It seems to actually be these big pesticide and fertilizer companies. So who are they? Well, this is actually from the CBAN, the Canadian Biotechnical Network, Action Network. And actually they kind of compiled the largest companies in seeds and agrochemicals. And what we could realize here is a lot of these companies are actually merging into these big, large companies. because right now you see Bayer and Bayer, but before actually Monsanto used to be part of this list also, but now Monsanto is owned by Bayer. So here we had actually a merger by Dow and DuPont, who formed it to Corteva, and Syngenta and Chinachem have also been part of mergers that are actually forming these multi-conglomerate large corporations that sell seeds and agrochemicals. So here we see BASF amongst other players, but these are the large agrochemical companies and seed companies that are actually propagating this idea basically of keeping on with overextending production, using GMOs, using chemical fertilizers, using pesticides, and basically that's how they make their money, okay? And these are very, very large companies. Well, if we actually dissect who these companies are, they're actually very bad companies. And I don't like to say, good or bad, they're evil or whatever the case is, but let's look at some of the practices that they've been up to. And I would say, very confidently from myself that I don't think these are the companies that we should be supporting. Why? Well, these companies used to be chemical weapons manufacturing companies, okay? For the most part, most of them were involved in that. So Monsanto actually used to use chemicals. Actually, they manufactured Agent Orange. And actually, if you go to this link here, it's on Monsanto's company's website, talk about actually using Agent Orange. And basically, the chemicals that were used were pesticides that were actually combined together. And they used to be in these orange barrels. That's why it was called Agent Orange. But then were used, actually, the combination of these two pesticides were used to, basically kind of partake in war and to gas people. So Monsanto has been involved in the manufacturing of chemical weapons and the sales of it. Monsanto has been caught ghostwriting academic papers trying to convince people in the world that glyphosate is not harmful. And actually, this is a link to a scientific journal from, I think it was PubMed that I obtained this, but there's a whole bunch of other articles from peer-reviewed sources that actually look at Monsanto and their ghostwriting of academic papers, which basically means they link on as a third party, they make sure they tailor the results to something that is favorable to their company, and then they publish it under names of reputable scientists that actually will gain a lot of traction in the scientific world. They've been trying to convince people that glyphosate is safe, although the World Health Organization has labeled it as something that is potentially carcinogenic. And there's other people that have gone around and actually made statements. Some of them are Monsanto lobbyists. And in this video here, which I'm not going to show you right now, but you can actually click on the link. It's actually an individual who actually went to purport on French television that Roundup is safe to drink despite what people think. And anyways, was quite embarrassed afterwards when the person in the interview challenged him to drink a quart of glyphosate, and he refused and left. The individual in question actually claims that he's not a Monsanto lobbyist, although people have debated whether that's true or not. Regardless of the case, is that actually a lot of people that are quite reputable have stepped up and came to make false claims about Monsanto, either because they've been paid to do so, or in other cases, maybe have just made false claims because it goes along with their beliefs. Monsanto has sued farmers for a whole bunch of different things. And actually, if you look at The World According to Monsanto, there's a documentary that actually documents people's involvement with getting sued by Monsanto when their crops are cross-pollinated with Monsanto crops that come from other places. So it's not that the farmers themselves bought Monsanto seeds illegally, but actually plants will cross-pollinate if they're in close vicinity to each other. And what's happened to a lot of farms is actually some of the pollination from Monsanto crops have blown into other fields and actually cross-pollinated and actually have now become the genetics of the Monsanto seed. And Monsanto, because they own the patents to these seeds, have gone around suing farmers and basically claiming that they own the patents to the plants that are in the farmers' territories. You could actually check that out. Monsanto here has actually been challenged and sued by a person who claimed that they actually got cancer from glyphosate. And one of the courts in the United States actually ruled in favor that this is true. And actually this I think it was a janitor, not a farmer, but anyway, somebody that was working on the land won a court case against Monsanto. And the courts have recognized that glyphosate is something that's cancer causing. So another thing is Monsanto, as well as BASF, used to be part of IG Farben. IG Farben was actually a chemicals manufacturing company that during the World Wars was making Zyklon B, and especially during the concentration camps during the war, they were using Zyklon B. So, Bayer and BASF were part of companies that were actually, German companies that were making gas for the gas chambers in the World Wars, World War II especially. So these are companies that have actually been involved in war, have been involved in death and destruction. Dow Chemical has invented Agent Orange and produced Agent Orange. Dow Chemical also owns Union Carbide, who's actually responsible for a large, devastating explosion in Bhopal, India, which actually happened because of the production of a pesticide. So these companies have been involved with very, very bad practices. And these are some of the worst companies when it comes to what they bring into the world. Now, these companies are also the most profitable if you actually look at the other chart that I was showing you before. So these are the big companies here that are actually controlling a lot of the agricultural inputs that are coming into farming. And the ones here actually taking a lot of the farming profits away from farmers because the farmers are going into debt to be able to pay for all of the things that are being sold from these companies, okay? So buying seeds, buying chemicals, and all of this stuff. Now, if we actually deconstruct what's wrong with our food system, we could actually go into a little bit more of a critique. So it's not just about these companies specifically, although they're companies that actually have quite bad practices. Just the kind of the whole global food system right now, there's many different issues that occur because of the practices that we have today. So there's issues with food security. There's over 800 million people in the world that are starving till today. The Green Revolution and this idea of increasing production has been around since World War II has ended. Basically, the idea here is that if we increase agricultural outputs, then we could feed the world over. And that has not been the case. So, just by mechanizing farms and actually adding all these inputs that are supposed to actually have high yielding crops, we have not been able to save the world from starvation and malnutrition. And actually, even more now over the past, I think, about 5 or 10 years, we're actually increasing in the amount of people that are going starving. I would say, with this pandemic especially, we're going to see a major increase in starvation worldwide, especially with different things that are going on in the world, like fires in the Amazon, like locusts that are actually invading parts of Africa right now, and because of climate change, soil degradation, and other things, is that actually we're going to see increases in food insecurity. So issues with food sovereignty. Peasants and farmers are being affected by free trade agreements and food dumping. Like I was talking to, countries in the global south receive a lot of subsidized foods that are dumped into their markets, which actually makes it very difficult for farmers to be able to compete in those markets. And a lot of the time are not able to actually function as a business and as a farm to sell to people in their local environments. And because of free trade agreements and subsidized food coming from the global north, it makes it very difficult. So this is why groups like Via de Campesina and other groups in the global south have actually pushed the idea of food sovereignty, is that the people, peasants and farmers, need the ability to reproduce themselves, their farms, their communities. So there's issues with genetic modification. Epigenetics matter. So if anyone actually has studied genetics, is that there are markers basically that will dictate how slices of genomes actually interact with their environments. So genetics actually will interact with their environments, and certain genes will actually be more present, or basically will be able to be more expressive depending on different stress levels in a body or in a plant. And this really depends on how they interact with their environment. So basically genetic markers make it so that different forms of genetics are more prominent or actually more displayed, and are be able to kind of be triggered and turned on and off depending on genetic markers and how they interact with their environment. So it's not that we could just cut genomes or slices of genomes and put them in other things and it just replicates without any problems, is that actually our genes interact with our environments. And because of certain types of environments, genes will express themselves differently. So I could get more into that, but we'll do that at another point. And if you don't necessarily understand what that means, don't worry about it for now, because we're going to actually touch on epigenetics later on when we deconstruct GMOs. There's issues with herbicides. So glyphosates are being identified as cancer causing. So herbicides basically are things that kill weeds, are sprayed, and usually you have a Roundup Ready crop, which basically is tolerant to the herbicide that's being used. So basically the plants are genetically modified, so you could spray them with these poisons and then the plants won't die. Well, one thing about that is actually we're spraying the plants with herbicides that are tolerant to it, and actually that is a poison on its own. And some of these poisons have been identified as cancer causing, or at least potentially cancer causing. So there's issues with privatization. So when companies patent some form of genetic plant or whatever the case is, basically through GMO processes, is they have the restricted access to these plants, and anybody that wants them has to pay for it. So with privatization and restricted access to plants, is that we can't necessarily get plants all over the world in ways that don't violate these patents. And sometimes, like I was telling you before, in cases of Monsanto and some other companies, is that when there's cross-fertilization or when people are using seeds and violating these patents, then it comes with sometimes legal consequences. So GMOs actually restrict access to food to people across the world. There's also issues with costs on farmers. So I showed you before through Darren Quailman's research is in Canada especially, because of the debt that the farmers are accumulating, it's not sustainable economically. So there are issues with actually sustaining farms and family farms and being able to manage as a farmer. Issues with reduction in biodiversity. We're destroying our nature. So we're basically creating these monoculture fields of growing the same crop and basically, have these large farms that only grow corn, or only grow soy, or whatever the case is. And this is not good for the land itself. It actually destroys the land's ability to reproduce itself because it actually takes away the nutrients from the land. And actually, if we're doing monoculture, we don't necessarily, the farmers will till their land. So they're not going to have things that are perennial that actually keep the soil together, like rooting structures and other things, as well as they use chemical pesticides and fertilizers in order to actually, obtain nutrients in the soil and to actually make sure that unwanted plants don't grow. But this is devastating to the soil. So we're reducing biodiversity by using these genetically modified seeds and basically kind of using them in environments where we're producing these monoculture crops and destroying our land because of that. Actually, in the chapter that I had you read for today, they went into a large discussion about the non-arability of soil and how we're losing the arable soil. And this is going to be a problem. It's actually a problem of today, but is going to be a large problem going forward. Unwanted genetic spreading into non-GMO farms and lawsuits. So I've already described some of that. And if you want to get more into that, watch the documentary that I linked to my PowerPoint presentation. Issues with loss of indigenous farming methods. So by actually putting in this idea that science is all about manufacturing GMOs and manufacturing fertilizers and chemicals and having new technologies, we're actually taking away from the indigenous knowledge of farming methods that actually interact more in a symbiotic relationship with the land, with nature, and we're losing these understandings because what we're saying is the science that's more important is the science that's actually building technologies and the ones that are really destroying the land itself and limiting biodiversity, where indigenous farming methods were actually about having great biodiversity and actually interacting with our land in a way that's more symbiotically. So we need to prioritize things that are helpful to the world and things that actually are not destructive. And these understandings are being lost in our scientific debates. Soil arability, we're killing our soil, which a lot of people don't necessarily think about because a lot of you that maybe haven't gardened yet will just go outside and you say, well, look, there's soil everywhere. Sure, but not all of it is arable, and not all of it is able to grow different forms of food. So we need actually soil that contains nutrients and things that are actually, have microbes and other things in the soil that will actually help our plants thrive. We're killing pollinators. So a lot of the pesticides actually kill bees. We need bees in order to pollinate our plants. They're the things that go from flower to flower and make sure that our plants are pollinated. So we need to keep our pollinators. We're also creating water dead zones. Basically, it's nitrogen runoff coming from different farms that accumulate in different bodies of water. You can actually look at the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes right now in Canada, in the United States, have dead zones where there's big accumulations of nitrogen where no living life forms could actually grow in. So it's killing different areas of our water and actually making it very polluted. We have corporate concentration of agribusiness. So we're actually having fewer and fewer companies that are owning more and more. And they're actually monopolizing over these services and usurping a lot of the money that is actually going towards the farmer. And like I was showing you before, a lot of these companies actually have very bad practices. A lot of them are former war companies or produce things that actually bring war destruction and death into the world. And they're not very helpful to the world. Issues with our health. So a lot of our foods now contain toxins. We're spraying things with pesticides. Some of the GMOs have been considered unsafe. So it's also for our health is that we need food that is actually whole foods that is going to contribute to our longevity. There's rising costs of seeds and chemicals. We don't actually need to buy seeds. Fruits and plants produce their own seeds. They will actually reproduce themselves if you allow them to. But now actually we've commodified the seed process, and in that process we have to rely on these big chemical and seed companies to basically be able to reproduce our farms, which is quite taxing on the farmers. So research being directed at GMOs instead of being directed at traditional breeding methods. So science is not only about GMOs, and this is one thing that we keep on hearing more and more about, is that anybody that goes against GMOs and goes against mechanization is coming from an unscientific foundation, and that's simply not true. There are different ways of viewing science. Science is a method of inquiry. It's a way to actually understand the world. It is not just about the outcomes of science. It's actually about a process. So science could be about actually understanding indigenous methods of growing or other forms of breeding. And right now what we're doing is we're actually a lot of the science and the funding for science is actually going into the large kind of agrochemical understandings of how we should actually be growing crops. Pest and weed resistance to Bt crops and to glyphosate. Okay, so we're actually introducing forms of crops that have Bacillus thuringiensis, which basically is a spore that fights off different worms, basically cotton worms and other things that are quite destructive. And actually what people have done in cotton fields and other places where this worm is actually quite present is have combined Bacillus thuringiensis right into the plant itself. Now these worms are actually developing resistance to it. So even the pesticides and the different GMO crops that we've have to ward off these pests, the pests are actually adapting to it. But if we don't adapt at the same time through breeding methods or other ways, then we're going to lose our crops to these things that are actually adapting. So these are just some examples of a critique of our current food system. So we're going to get more in depth on these things. And I don't necessarily want to scare you. I want to put this at the forefront because I want this to be a very tangible critique, and I want this to be rooted in actual problems, and then we're going to figure out ways to deal with this. And hopefully in this course, it's not just about dwelling on the negative, but actually figuring out how to develop more sustainable ways of farming and more sustainable ways of interacting with food. So I showed you this a little while ago, but some of the understanding is that, well, the food system is broken and we just need to fix it. And we're going to read a book actually by Eric Holt Gimenez. And I think this is quite an interesting understanding. So what Eric Holt Gimenez says is, calls to fix a broken food system, assume that the capitalist food system used to work well. This assumption ignores the food system's long racialized history of mistreatment of people of color. The food system is unjust and unsustainable, but it's not broken. It functions precisely as the capitalist food system has always worked, concentrating power in the hands of the privileged minority and passing off social and environmental externalities disproportionately to racialized, stigmatized groups. So it is actually a system that has been developed to serve the people that are actually developing this food system. So companies like Bayer, companies like Monsanto, BASF, and these large food companies are actually making a heck of a lot of money out of doing the practices that they're doing. And actually everything that they would consider negative, they usually kind of pass off as an externality. Oh, well, this is just the consequences of our food system, when we could actually be developing a better food system altogether. But in order to do so, we have to realize it's not just about fixing small things in our food system, but actually re-envisioning the food system itself and actually derooting it from things like colonialism, slavery, which in some extent still exists today, We have migrant workers working in Canada in quite appalling conditions right now and contracting COVID and basically not given the same rights as people that are actually citizens of Canada. So we are still actually using similar practices that we maybe would think that this is a thing of the past. No, our food system relies on things that these companies are considering externalities like pollution, climate change, and all of this stuff is actually part and parcel of the food system that we've set up. What we need to do is we need to rethink the food system and we need to reprioritize and build things that are actually going to bring positivity in the world and not have these negative consequences that I'm describing in the other slide. So here's some more specific solutions, and these are not only the solutions that you could do, but they are some solutions that I think actually would have a more long-lasting effect. So number one, reconnect with food, okay? I'm trying to encourage you to do this in this course through the different experiments that we're doing. And I know some of them are quite daunting experiments because if you've never done them before, I don't expect that you're going to jump in and become an expert. We're doing sourdoughs and we're growing plants for now, but I want you to actually reconnect with food in the bigger process. Start to ferment things, start to figure out ways of drying foods and preserving foods, or start cooking with ingredients that are more whole ingredients, like dried beans and other things like that. Which for people on a budget, actually, it's a very good thing to do. But also in a health perspective, is that these are more whole foods and a lot better for us rather than going towards GMO crops and other things as well. We need to prioritize our biosphere and our social system over markets. And I tried to describe that, or I did describe this in one of the first classes or the second class. And I'm actually going to get back to that again. But basically, we need to reprioritize things that have an effect on other systems. So the biosphere affects social systems, and social systems affect markets, okay? Markets could affect the biosphere, but usually does this in a negative way because a lot of the market proceedings or a lot of the behaviors that are happening through markets are actually quite destructive to the biosphere the way that we presently have it. So we need to reprioritize our whole economy and think of actually the things that are necessary for economy to actually make sense and to exist, which means that we need to have a healthy biosphere and healthy social systems. And then the market basically becomes a tool for us to be able to trade and to facilitate these social interactions that have to do with production. We need to participate in more progressive and radical food movements. So I showed you last class, and this is actually coming from Eric Holt-Gimenez, kind of a breakdown of different food movements. So one of them being, just about reforming the food system itself, and basically kind of just, repurposing surplus or giving charity to different groups so that they could actually have access to food also. But like I was saying, these are just band-aid solutions and don't go to the root causes of the problem. And the root causes is we actually need to change the food system itself, and we need to reprioritize better practices within that. And we need to reprioritize the biosphere and social systems. And this could only happen in more progressive and radical food movements. We need to recognize that the food economy and the food system that we've set up from the whole system itself has major issues that need to be restructured. And in order to do that, we need to actually rethink and radicalize and have a more progressive food system, as well as social system also. So, in order to have food justice, we need to have social justice. People need to have equal rights and equal opportunities. And in order to be able to afford food, especially if we have food markets, is we need people to have at least some kind of living standards of, what they're able to make in a society. What we've noticed since the 1980s, especially in Canada, is minimum wage has not increased all that much. It has not gone at the same rates that especially the top 1% of the salaries are going, as well as it's not even keeping up with inflation. So it's very difficult to be able to afford food when food is actually administered in markets, when people are actually not increasing their basic standards of living. And another thing that you could do is you could get involved with campus and or community food initiatives. So go take part, go try to change, the campus is actually not open right now, so you might not be able to get involved in the campus groups for the present moment, but I would say get involved with community initiatives. And in this course, I'm going to also have you do that as well by getting involved with different things in and around your community. So these are more specific solutions, and I'm going to break this down to understand some of these things in a little bit more detail. So you're going to notice that some of the stuff that I'm describing after the slide here is not included in the readings, but these are things that will hopefully give you a foundation of understanding how economies work so that we could actually look at changing the food economy and prioritizing things that are better. So this comes from Vandana Shiva, who wrote a book and talked about living economies. And this is very similar to what I've showed you in other slides. So basically just to show you one of the slides that I've showed you in another class is actually rethinking this idea of the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is that we need to have this middle ground where people, profitability, and the planet come together, and sustainability is seen as being achieved when all of these three spheres meet in congruence in the middle. And like I was saying, well, that's not necessarily a good way of thinking about sustainability, because the environment or the biosphere is actually contains the other spheres and actually affects them all in a way that actually could do away with them. So if the environment is not habitable anymore for people, then we can't have society. And if society itself has different functionings, this is where the economy comes from. It comes from a society. It comes from groups of people that are actually managing large forms of production and basically managing how goods and services go out to people in the society. So the economy actually is built into a society, but comes from social interaction. And on top of that, the environment itself is the thing that contains society. So what is Vandana Shiva talking about here is basically talks about three stable constellations of these economies and three unstable constellations of these economies. So what she's claiming here is that we need a kind of a bottoms-up approach where nature's economy is the most important. And then we have the sustenance economy, which basically means that we need to sustain ourselves. We need to reproduce ourselves and our social contexts. And then basically from that, we could have markets as part of the way to sustain ourselves. It doesn't mean that we need to rule it out completely from the market, but the market can't be the thing that dictates everything, because it's actually something that we've created in order to facilitate different social interactions. So it's something that is, you know, part of all societies, but doesn't need to control the way society functions. What she's saying is we have an unstable version of these three constellations, but basically being dictated by financial markets. So it seems that the stock markets and high finance, the large companies, are actually pulling the strings, putting their financing, and basically kind of creating the conditions of what is going to take place in the world. Okay, so by actually directing financial resources, they're creating things that come into fruition. So what does that mean altogether is, you know, if a company invests into chemical weapons, let's just say, well, then that's what's going to be developed. If we invest into sustainable futures, like, you know, greening different areas, well, that's what comes into existence. And if we look at actually how we've structured our democracy, is the financial markets have a very big context of what actually gets produced in the world. So these are not in the ways of democracy. These are not things that people decide, but actually people with a lot of financial capital control the way things come into existence in the world by directing money and resources toward it. So basically, in what she's saying is that we've made these three constellations unstable because the market economy seems to be controlling the sustenance economy, which is basically trying to control nature's economy. And what we're going to see is a breakdown of nature's economy. We're actually seeing this presently. So food is a very big part of climate change. It's a very big part of, you know, why certain places in the world are burning, like the Amazon, like even Australia and other things like that. In Africa, there was large fires actually that took place and are still taking place. So we need to rethink the way that we're actually prioritizing our economy, and basically realize that we need to prioritize the biosphere, more importantly, over economic markets, because markets could still exist later, but they can't exist without a biosphere. So I want to get to breaking down an economy, and actually I wanted to introduce theories by Katherine Gibson, and basically her pen name is Gibson Graham, because she actually used to produce a lot of texts with Julie Graham, who actually has passed on of cancer, unfortunately. But the works of both Katherine Gibson and Julie Graham are actually quite influential in understanding diverse economies, okay? So basically what they're looking at is, if we actually look at only what is available in kind of this capital-centric understanding or only looking at market interactions, then we leave out a good majority of actually what happens in an economy. And in order to change the way that we understand and the way that we practice in an economy, is basically we have to bring different things into being. So basically what they're calling a performative ontological politics is that by doing things in the world, we create conditions for new possibilities. You know, by me going and working, let's just say in a community garden, I'm actually tangibly producing food, and I'm creating relationships and social surroundings that could actually bring different things into the world. And this is the way that we should envision changing our food systems, but also, you know, creating new economic conditions, or at least locating economic conditions that currently exist that are better for us, and then hopefully expanding them by, you know, making them flourish in different environments, or actually even expanding them into larger entities that actually have more of a jurisdiction over certain food entities or food practices. So in order to think of Gibson Graham and what they're purporting here, so basically what they're saying is what we see in our society is usually what is produced in a capitalist firm or through capitalist wage labor. So these things are measurable. Actually, we measure them through GDP, so gross domestic product. We can measure the productivity of a society based on, you know, what's being produced and what's being sold. But there's so many other things that are going unnoticed that actually make it so that we have the economies that we do today. You know, things that are gift giving or self-employment or, you know, bartering systems, things that you do at your home, like when you're making bread, you know, when you're actually even child rearing and other things like that. This is actually part of an economy. They're things that actually are bringing things into the world. You know, if you grow a garden itself, you're growing your own food. This is part of an economy. You do your dishes. This is actually part of an economy also. You know, some people hire other people to do that for them and basically have nannies or, you know, have live-in people that are caretakers or whatever the case is of these kind of economic conditions. But we do so much that it goes unnoticed because these things are not measured by GDP. And actually pointed out by Gibson Graham, most of the practices that we see there are practices that a lot of people will ascribe to things that women do in society. And actually a lot of these things go unnoticed. So part of Katharine Gibson's critique is actually a lot of the work that women do go unnoticed because it's not measurable, okay? So what we need to do is we need to understand that these are actually part of an economy also, and without all of the things that we're doing on the sides and doing in our own home provisioning, is that the economy wouldn't actually make sense because there's so much that goes on outside of just things that are measurable by GDP. So what are these things? Okay. Well, Gibson Graham break it down into different categories. So they break it down into a labor category, transaction category, property category, enterprise category, finance category. And then they further break these down into 3 different kind of approaches to understand it. So labor, okay, we could have wage labor. So basically, usually what we measure under any kind of capitalist firm is that people get paid for the work that they do, and that is actually identifiable. Everybody probably knows what I'm talking about. But there's other forms. So we have alternative paid labor. So self-employment, reciprocal labor, in-kind labor, work for welfare. These things exist also. Some of these things are measurable in the economic society that we've set up because some of them are still connected to capitalist forms of labor, but other ones are not. So household work, volunteer work, self-provisioning, and actually in this, she will qualify slave labor as actually being something in existence today that still exists in societies. And, you know, even though we don't like to admit it, there are still versions of slave labor. So these things here are work that is actually unpaid and unrecognized in capitalist economies. So we need to recognize that other things exist. And, you know, not to say that these things are good or bad, because a lot of people say that, you know, slave labor is not something that we should be prioritizing. I definitely agree with that. But these are things that we need to recognize also exist within capitalist forms of labor. So it's not just about wage labor. There's all of these other things that go usually unnoticed. We're looking at transactions. So there's other forms of transactions just, you know, outside of markets. Usually what we notice is things that are transactions because we go to a store, we pick up whatever it is that we want at the store. we could see other forms of transactions existing. They're measurable. We could actually look at the stock markets and other things, and we could see these transactions taking place. But there are alternative forms also. So we have alternative markets. We have things that prioritize more of the social context or prioritize the biosphere that is a little bit different than just normal kind of just go to markets and try to get as much money as you can. But actually there are things like fair trade. So actually there are markets that prioritize people's labor better than just traditional markets. Alternative forms of currencies. So there's things in Ithaca. They have the Ithaca hour, which is actually a dollar that was based on labor dollars. And there's other forms of currencies as well that exist in the world. So underground markets, barter systems still exist. So you could kind of trade with people here and there. These things also exist in today's society. We also have non-markets as well. So household sharing, gift giving, hunting, fishing, gathering, theft, piracy, and poaching as well exist as forms of transactions. And actually, if we're looking at kind of this idea of transactions in the Creative Commons, kind of the antithesis to a lot of ideas of capitalism is this idea of sharing. So what happened here when people were able to share online is actually capitalist firms started to get very scared of this. So things like Napster or other music sharing platforms were actually brought to the legal context, basically sued by corporations and other things, because they know that sharing and markets don't necessarily go together. One way to actually look at non-market-based interactions is actually thinking of gift-giving economies, which actually existed and flourished actually in a lot of societies throughout the world. It exists still today, but actually was a way that people got goods and services before capitalism became what it was in this present moment. If you actually want a good history of this, you could read Karl Polanyi and The Great Transformation. And actually Karl Polanyi looks at different ways that people got goods and services over our history. And actually one of the ways was reciprocity-based economies where people actually would kind of share together, which happened in, which was actually a thing that was prioritized in a lot of communities before the advent of capitalism. And also redistribution and other things, basically looking at other forms of economies that existed outside of markets. So I'd highly encourage you to look at Polanyi's Great Transformation. Other things as well. So if we look at property, we could probably identify private property existing, sure, but there are other forms of property also. So alternative to private property, we could have state-managed assets, where the state actually owns certain things as well that could be considered things that are in the public domain. So customary clan land, we could look at community land trusts, and indigenous knowledge also is alternative to private. We could also look at open access as well. So we have the atmosphere right now that's not been commodified, international waters, open source IP addresses, outer space. Although, a lot of these things are coming into the realm of being commodified. There's actually a company in BC that sells air in canisters to people in China. So, we're presently in the process of commodifying air. Other things that exist also. So enterprises, we could think of kind of traditional business firms, things that operate within capitalism. But we could also think of other things as well. So there are alternative to capitalist-owned firms. So we have state-owned firms, like, you could think of like Crown corporations in Canada, or things that are owned by like the Quebec government, like the SAQ or other things as well. Environmentally responsible firms also, so things that don't necessarily just prioritize profit. Socially responsible firms, firms that operate not for profit. So these are in the alternative realm. But we also have non-capitalists. We actually have workers' cooperative, where the workers own their means of production. And basically because of that, it's not a capitalist firm. Sole proprietorships, basically people that are in charge of their own labor that don't exploit other people. Okay, so that's part of a non-capitalist arrangement in the workplace. We also have community enterprises that exist. Some feudal parts of society still that kind of live off the land and live together communally. And like said before under labor, there are some slave enterprises basically that will employ people in conditions that are not livable and basically make them work in different fields or make them work in different endeavors. So there are different forms of enterprise that exist. And there's different forms of finance. So we have mainstream markets. You know, we could measure these things and we could see them. You could probably open most newspapers and they have a financial section that talks about the stock market and all these other things. But we also have alternatives to this also. So cooperative banks. One actually, if you look at Desjardins, the Caisse Populaire, this is a cooperative bank. We could have credit unions also, where actually it is now owned by the people that are actually part of the credit union, and actually loans could be done in that fashion, where the people actually own the kind of credit unions themselves, or basically the firms, and lend out money to other people in, you know, the same context, but actually the profits then don't go externally, they go to the people that own the credit unions, and usually that is part of the community. We have community-based financial institutions and microfinancing. So basically financing that is done to very small companies, usually with you know, very little strings attached, to kind of just help out local community businesses get off the ground. We also have non-market ways of actually financing things. So sweat equity, we could actually put on our own labor in order to finance certain things getting off the ground. Family lending, donations, interest-free loans. So there are a lot of things that exist outside of capitalism, okay? Now, why am I showing you this is because, especially today, with a lot of the breakdown in supply chains and a lot of discussion actually about what kind of labor is being prioritized, especially during COVID situation. There's been a lot of discussion about, you know, capitalism not functioning, and, you know, just even watching the United States media, a lot of times there's a very heavy critique on, you know, basically kind of labeling anyone with any kind of leftist point of view as, you know, you're a communist or a socialist, and usually kind of describing this as a negative connotation. What I'm encouraging you to do is this. Yes, we could define things through isms. Okay, we could say capitalism, communism, socialism, but usually this comes with very heavy baggage. There's usually a lot of nuances that are attached to these terms that sometimes are unfounded or actually not even reflective of the beliefs that are actually being purported. There's a better way to think about this, okay? And I think the better way is actually to understand that there's a mixed economy. So in the United States and Canada, we have realms of social provisions. Basically, you know, in Canada, we have Medicare. We have roads even in the United States, even though they might not have Medicare the way we do in Canada. There is state provisioning of building like infrastructure, like roads and like other things like that actually exist. So these are things that the state provides that actually comes out of tax assets and is provided by the communities. The United States actually invests very heavily into militarization. They invest into war arms and things like that. But these are actually part of socialist contexts. It's tax money that's going into providing these things in society and building, okay? So, you know, we don't need to understand things as being the ultimates, because capitalism itself, yes, we have a capitalist mode of functioning as the dominant form, but within that, there are other things that exist also. And if we don't recognize these things, it's really easy to be caught in this kind of like vacuum of understanding and just point to these isms and say how they don't function. But we could actually do a better approach and say, well, you know, what are the things in here that actually function well? And how can we prioritize other practices that are not just capitalist practices? And how do we actually then change our economy to prioritize things that do better for the social spheres and for the biosphere also? And this is a really good approach to think of these things, because it's hard to get trapped into the isms. And basically, you know, here we could get rid of a little bit of the baggage when it comes to terming the way that we want to see economies and political systems function. Anyhow, we're going to get more into this. This is just an introduction, and I know this is a lot of information to digest in one sitting here, but we're going to be discussing these things more and more as time goes on. Before I move on, though, I want to show you a different approach, and there are some issues that I have with this. This is derived from an article written by John Pierce about social economies. And the one thing I like about this that deviates from Gibson Graham is actually what they're looking at is entities, basically organizations, and how these organizations fit into the economy itself, and basically labeling it between different spheres of the economy. So basically here you could see more of the social economy, or things that actually relate more to the social sphere. Here that actually the first system, or what they call the private system, is more of things that operate within markets, or basically things that would be considered more profit oriented, or I guess, you know, telling you not to use the word isms, but things that would be more in line with kind of a capitalist understanding of the world. Here we have more of the state provisioned or public services. So things that are actually, given by the state or organized by the state. We could look at this in, global context. United Nations are very big things that operate, but also very small things like community councils or things within our local neighborhoods. And then the third approach actually is to look at what they call the social economy, which basically includes social enterprises and volunteer organizations. And basically kind of the other economy that they're talking about is more of the family economy as well, which we'll also discuss. But let's start here with the social economy. So here we're looking at social enterprises. So social enterprises are usually firms that work in conditions or market context. So basically usually things that are owned mutually by groups of people that are actually participating in the labor form, or connected to the labor form somehow through different arrangements. Excuse me. So for example, in Quebec, we have different forms of cooperatives. One is a workers' co-op, where actually the workers are the owners of the business. Excuse me. But then we also have solidarity co-ops, where there's multi-stakeholders. So these multi-stakeholders could be investors, they could be workers, or they could be even the consumers. Excuse me. So there are different arrangements of cooperatives, but the workers' cooperatives, the idea here is the workers are the ones that are controlling the means of production. So they are part of the social enterprise, but also kind of on the border of this private system itself, because they could work for profit, but are actually owned by the workers. So technically they're not being exploited in their labor conditions because they are owners of their own labor. Within that, we have different scales of companies. So we have large social enterprises. One you could think of as the Mondragon Corporation, if anyone wants to look that up. They're actually located in the Basque region of Spain. They're a very large workers' cooperative and actually have a very intricate model of how the cooperative functions, which at one point in the course we're going to get to, but it's a little bit beyond the lecture for today. But we also have community economies. So different community enterprises and social firms. We also have time banks. We have local exchange banks also. LETs, basically local exchange systems. And we have volunteer organizations and other things as well. So within the volunteer organizations, we could have anything from churches and charities, local volunteer organizations, and other things of different scales. So some smaller ones that you might know within your community itself, which also crosses over here to the family and self-help economy. So we have conditions of diaspora where people actually leave sometimes their home environment, will go work somewhere else in another country and then provide provisions basically back to their own families, to their nuclear families. But we actually have also people that do different things within their own family to meet the needs of what their family wants. So basically growing food and doing more of the home provision. So we can look at the economy based on these kind of three spheres as well. So the first system, private system, second system, public system, third system, more of the social economy based system. And within that, there's different scales of how these organizations fit into the economy. Why is this important in food is that we have to recognize that it's not just one form of an economy that exists, but there are all of these things that go into understanding how economies function. Now, a couple critiques on this. So first of all, I do not like the word black economy to refer to, usually what they're talking about is illegal trading. And here, actually, John Pierce has lumped this into the first system, so the profit-oriented system. And if anybody's been following the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec, we actually know that this actually crosses over to the public system also. So I would actually take away the word black economy and use the word legal economy, and actually then put it also into the realm of the public sphere, because the public sphere also have been guilty of very similar practices. We can also maybe think about this in kind of the, I guess, social economy realm of maybe kind of this Robin Hood scenario of people robbing from the rich and giving to the poor maybe, but I don't know, maybe that's beyond the comprehension of this diagram right here. Anyhow, so you can think of these spheres here incorporating all these different food elements. Here, you could look at like McDonald's as a large multinational corporation, and a local kind of farm, maybe within a smaller scale and maybe more connected to the community. So you can take all of these different food endeavors and kind of locate them here within the economy. And this comes together, I guess, by looking at different spheres, but usually the spheres that are described are civil society or social power, and economic power, basically kind of more of the market-driven or capitalist kind of envisionment, and state power, which comes from our public services or public institutions. And basically all of these things have an influence over the allocation of resources, control of production and distribution. And they actually control each other in different realms also. So for example, I could see very well right now, especially and not to pick on the United States here, but this is a very good example, is that by the way that people could fund electoral campaigns, we see economic power influencing state power, and then the state power influencing the allocation of goods and resources and controlling the economy. But actually in the United States, I would say economic power has a large part of that also. So the economy is actually controlled by economic power. The state powers actually could be or is controlled by a large part by the economic power. And basically you could see that there's unequal ways that all of these three things interact with the allocation of resources and control production and distribution. And the final thing that I want to bring to your attention is the systems map that I created, but not to necessarily nitpick over the organizations within it, but we could also think of food systems within cycles of production, processing, distribution, and waste management. And actually, if you're gonna deconstruct what I've been doing here, as you can see, I'm using market-based and non-market-based analysis, especially of distribution here, because like you've seen in Gibson Graham, it's not only things that are part of the capitalist economy that we need to identify, but also things that operate outside of that.